tutorial starts with a song, but it's only a few seconds long.
Computer animation. Computer animation. Computer animation.
Let's get started with animation. Hello friends, today we'll talk about the rolling shutter. What you currently see here is a rendering of GPU rendering, the graphics card is rendering. It wouldn't be much longer to render each frame using the CPU, but this is just fine. You see a decent speed of rendering of a propeller. And the propeller is being warped by an effect which is called the rolling shutter. It is accelerating actually, and I'll show you the whole scene in just a second. We're currently at frame 122, 22, 3, now 3, etc. We have a motion blur here, and what you already see is quite interesting, that the three blades, which are geometrically absolutely identical, look different now. So there's something deeply wrong with this rendering, because in the background you see the blades are totally intact. So this is the rendered animation. You see this flickering, and then the structure totally changes until it goes back to the original state. So this is a loop here. I'll show you different versions of this rendering in just a second, because here we have rolling shutter right, and that's what you just saw, off, top, bottom and left. And before we get to this, let me explain what's in the scene here. Actually, let me hide this, the propeller here. I created a NURBS curve, snapping to the grid, pressing and holding X snaps to the grid. You see, this is while I'm pressing X, because when I press and hold X, I snap the first point of the curve to the grid. And then and that's not really nicely visible now, maybe this is better, add a few more points here and a few more points here, and then I snap back to the very beginning of that curve. So that would be typically the first blade here. And when I go to the surfaces, modeling and surface, I can create this. And now the trick was, well, one of the tricks really, I select not the curve, but the surface, and then I go to edit and I duplicate special. I need the option box here. The default settings are like these. We just copy the object, which will land in the same position with the same rotation as we created it in the first place. What is the axis for rotation? That's the y-axis. It goes down into the scene because we're looking through the top window here. And down in the scene, y is right here. So the rotate is going to be 120. I want to rotate the duplicate by exactly 120 degrees. And the second rotation should be yet another 120 degrees, that is 240. So we have three blades at the same rotation distance. And I need number of copies 2. So that's a very precious window here. Here you see the blades, and I reset the settings and close it. And what I finally did here, I selected all three of them and by Control G put them into a group. And then I animated that group. So let me delete all these things because I have it already here. I unhide it. I only animated the Y rotation. We see an effect which is quite usual, quite common from films. It rotates very fast, but still it looks like standing still for a second, then it slows down again. I have a top 1 camera here. That's the camera where I rendered this effect, which you just saw. Let me go to the top shape and deactivate it, and then I reactivate it again. We need to go down to the Arnold section of the camera It can be a perspective camera, whatever. In this case, it's an orthographic camera. And we switch the effect off. We're currently, let's go to frame 170 or 60. And when we render it, I have a sky dome light in the scene. We get this effect. It's a typical motion blur effect. I need to activate motion blur in order to appreciate the rolling shutter. So motion blur is here. You go to the render settings right here, then to the Arnold render tab, and then you enable or disable the motion blur. We'll get back to this window, and now you've seen the rendering. It's this one. The rolling shutter freezes the geometry, and that's because the rolling shutter basically is a defect. So when I now go to the top version, which is basically saying from the top to the bottom, the rolling effect continues, then I see this effect. This is absolutely not what I modeled in the first place, because this is a 90-degree sort of angle, 90 degrees and 180 degrees. That's because of the high speed freeze and the rolling shutter effect. When I choose the bottom here, for example, and I re-render it, it looks different because the rolling shutter has 4 versions, basically, like creating a picture from line, 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 upwards, downwards, from left to right, and from right to left. For example, if you want to see this coming from the left, the rolling shutter effect, it's this one. This is the Wikipedia article about the rolling shutter. A typical image is this one. It's very irritating for people who fly in an aircraft or film an aircraft because the blades are warped. The photograph was done by Jonen. Rolling shutter is a method of image capture in which a still picture in a still camera or each frame of a video in a video camera or in a smartphone is captured not by taking a snapshot of the entire scene at a single instant in time, but rather by scanning across the scene rapidly, either vertically or horizontally. In other words, not all parts of the image of the scene are recorded at exactly the same instant. Want to see this in Catalan? That's what it looks like. Interesting picture as well. You would typically think this is fake, but it isn't. It is a defect of the rolling shutter effect in a smartphone or in a digital camera or an analog camera. And when we go to the German article about the rolling shutter effect, we see this quite interesting old photograph, 1922, and here you see the rolling shutter effect in a standard camera. It of course, this is a vertical line and the wheels are round, but due to that effect, which is typical for all kinds of cameras, this effect appears here. 2 things you need to take in account here. One is you go to the render settings and you need to enable motion blur. And here you need to go to in your camera settings, which in my case is a top 1 camera. You need to open the Arnold section and then activate the rolling shutter, which by default is off. That's why you see it like this with a motion blur. The rolling shutter duration is also interesting. Extend the rolling shutter duration to maybe 20 and re-render it. It uses a lot of frames to look forward and backward. This is the rolling shutter from the top. This is the rolling shutter from the bottom. From the left. And from the right. Finally, I show you a rendering which took some time really, with some reflection, refraction, etc. which I did of a scene with 3 moving objects, and they wobble left to right, up and down, etc. And they rotate, some of them rotate. And I show you the rolling shutter effect there. It looks as if you could model geometry, or warp real geometry here, but it's just a lens effect and nothing else really. And with this, I'll leave you with your own experiments. Have a nice day. Bye-bye.